King of Podcasts proudly presents The Broadcasters Podcast, a weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Now please welcome your host, a traditional and digital media professional with over 25 years of experience, including the last 15 years in podcasting. Here is the King of Podcasts. And I'm reading through all these different stories. Podcasting in 2020. Podcasting in 2020. What's it going to be like? The future of it? Is it dead? I'm reading all this crap. It really is crap that I'm reading now from a lot of people, and I need to go ahead and debunk. Now, why can't I do this? Well, there's a reason I call myself King of Podcasts. And there's a couple things I'm going to go ahead and talk about tonight to get the Broadcasters Podcast on tonight and get things started. Because one of those moods that people are kind of just taking shots at the industry when they really don't know what they're talking about. You know, the Bob Pittmans of the world. Podcasting is radio's birthright. Things like that, okay? But I think people are just kind of putting clickbait out there, and I need to go and debunk some of this so that people don't get caught up into the whole mess, thinking that it's all true and everybody needs to be concerned. But we don't need that. I don't think anybody needs to be worried about what they're reading out there. I need to go ahead and just put it into perspective. Now, I can say that because I've done over 10,000 podcasts. I've produced over 10,000 in my time since 2005. I will be 15 years in the business come August 2020. I've already completed I'm already into my 25th year in media in general. So I can speak for that. I've worked in radio for a long time. I've worked in podcasting for a long time. And when I look at everything else, when it comes to what people are saying about the business, they don't know what they're talking about. So let's go and bring it up. Let's go and talk about what people might be missing about. Let's go ahead and go through the stories. What I also have for you tonight on the program, really great stuff, is radio and television golf commentating phenomenon, Ann Liguori. I will have her on the program a little bit later on as we go through and talk about all different issues in the world of sportscasting and really just go back in her story and talk about how sports is going through the changes they're going through today in terms of the different cultural, social, political conformities that are out there, the corporate conformities on top of that, and what she's been able to do in her very illustrious career. Really great stuff. So Ann Liguori coming up later on the program, my first part of two parts that I'll go and bring to you a little bit later on. But like I said, three stories I need to go and bring up. I'm going to pull up a few stories talking about podcasting and how it's affecting the media in 2020. We'll talk about that. One other thing I also have to bring up a little bit later on tonight is the unfortunate retirement of one of the most popular, one of the most influential, celebrated names in radio, who retired last week, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I'm going to bring it up now. Or actually, he did it over the weekend. Tom Joyner, the fly jock, who has been doing the Tom Joyner Morning Show 25 years he's been doing his show, and he has retired. And it's over a contract issue. So even here, I'm really surprised by what happens. So I'm going to talk about how important Tom Joyner is and all the years he put into radio and how unfortunate this is for a lot of people. And most importantly, the black community, the African-American community, if you want to call it that. It's true. A lot of people woke up to him, and he was very important to a lot of different people. And he contributed a lot. And by the way, what a charitable guy. You know, he was a real philanthropist and was just a hell of a guy from all he did. We're going to talk about that here on the program. I'll have a little bit of time to go ahead and pay tribute to a man who's not passed. He's not gone altogether. The bottom line is that we are here to say, hey, you know, it's a shame he's not going to be able to stay around and keep doing what he's been doing so well for 3 decades plus, right? At least. Like I started hearing, no, even farther than that. I don't know how far back he goes. But I remember hearing an air check of his from WGCI when he worked, which is the reason he calls himself the fly jock. There's a story behind that. I'll talk about that very shortly. So anyway, let's get into the stories about podcasting.
When I look at when I do a Google search for podcasting, everybody's going on and talking about it. So not too long ago, about a month ago, Forbes wrote a story, podcasting is going mainstream. The future of podcast in 2020 from IT Munch. Podcasting trends. Where's podcasting going? Podcast talking about podcasting, of course, and more. Well, let's look at the real facts. Inside Radio talks about the fact that one of the stories here is the fact that 1 in 4, and this is according to voiceovers.com, they did a survey of brand marketers, agency executives, commercials, producers, and others, reporting that 1 in 4 are more focused on digital audio advertising, with podcasting in particular a focus. So one of the respondents says that podcasts, quote, are seen as a way to grow an audience that has targeted needs. The Voices.com survey also said no media has had more growth and attention during the past year, with 57% of those who took the survey saying they're doing more podcast work than a year ago. Well, I started doing my own podcast work almost at a day 7 years ago. Starting now my 8th year independently of podcasting, but I'm in the middle of my 15th year of podcasting right now. Anyway, that's what's being said about that. And it's very interesting. Now, also, the prediction of this report says that throughout 2020, podcasts, audio advertising, and internet videos will continue the meteoric rise, but podcasts will be the real leaders in growth, as even more brands realize the benefits of producing a branded podcast. Well, there you go. These people would know. Very well said. So we'll leave that there. Moving along, that's one of the good stories that's being said, which I agree with what's being said. And there's some different stories that we talked about that. One of the stories that really got me to really talk about this tonight was from TechCrunch. And unfortunately, they don't even let you read the whole thing. It's behind a paywall. Bastards. All I got of this story was, like any burgeoning firm, podcast. Now, the story is labeled 2019, the year podcasting broke. And here's what I'm going to get from what they talk about. Now, they go through the story of how podcasting first came out. Now, of what they're talking about in the story, which I can only read a little bit of, but unfortunately, the bastards that were here don't want to go ahead and give you the story. They make you make sure to go ahead and click through it. So that was what really pissed me off. They mentioned that the numbers certainly bear it out. Spotify spending is the most commonly cited flashpoint. While the music streaming service hasn't given exact numbers, it announced plans to spend between $400 and $500 million on the genre in hopes of catching up with Apple's decade-and-a-half-long head start. Well, they don't talk about the fact that iHeartRadio did the same thing, and all these other companies are combining with others. And you see Wondery, and you see Panoply, and all these others all combining with each other. Oh, but we're going to go ahead and pick on Spotify because they're trying to become the podcast leader. iHeartRadio now wants to talk about themselves as the number one leader in podcasting. Whatever. But that right there just kind of tells things in a different perspective. Now, as we talked about here just a second ago, the big story of podcasting was all about Spotify, but will 2020 be the year Apple strikes back? So there's a few things that are going on within podcasting in 2020. There will be a new network that will be focused on listeners between the ages of 9 and 13 from a company called PRX. The network will be called Trax, and will roll out next year with shows from Gen Z Media, the CBC, Cocotazo Media, and folks from Night Vale Presents, among others. NPR is updating its fee model. So this is another way that the stations are able to get a kickback for programming and other services. The change will kick in 2021, gradually implemented over 3 years. Sony Music has announced a strategic investment in Neon Hum Media, and it extends Sony's growing ventures in podcasting. It shifts Neon Hum away from being an independent outfit, presumably positioning it for scale. Edison Research has a new blog post up on the reach and popularity of various genres based on collected data through their podcast consumer track service. And in the review, this story from Neiman Lab of Harvard Research, Neiman Foundation of Harvard, they wrote the story and said that the year began with Spotify weighing out $400 million to acquire 3 podcast companies, Gimlet Media, Paracast, and Anchor. That's how the year began, with an explosion. And then they move along and talk about getting an audio development deal with the Obamas, a cover story in the Hollywood Reporter, and everything kind of builds up from there. So over the course of the year, there's been some indication that Spotify has been able to do exactly what it has said it wants to do. Bring the full weight of its resources and capabilities to bear on podcasting. The past month alone has seen a steady rollout of new features meant to improve podcast discovery on its platform. Releases intimating that it has indeed seen meaningful growth in podcast listening. According to the third quarter earnings report, quote, we continue to see exponential growth in podcast hours streamed up approximately 39% quarter to quarter. Well, good for them. They'll find ways to go and use podcasting to keep people engaged in their platform. That's smart. I got no problem with that. It's a good place to go. And it's easy to get on as well, which is really great. Now, there are ramifications to parse through. And according to this story, it talks about how by spending so much money on podcast acquisition, Spotify has raised the perceived level of podcasting's potential value up, cultivating an elevated sense of competition and a momentum in an industry that, up to this point, largely adhered to a slow and steady and somewhat unsexy growth trajectory. Well, look, Spotify is doing the same thing that Apple TV is doing with Netflix in the game, right? So who wants to be the leader in streaming media? Well, we're seeing that battle right now. You know, new projects are all coming out as we go. Same thing goes with Spotify. They're trying to be the leader. iHeartRadio, the same way. They're all trying to find their spot and niche themselves. If they don't want to be networks and start buying up programming, then go ahead. Go for it. Good on them. We've talked about that on this show. That's not a big deal. So it's just getting corporatized. But the truth is, as long as there's a place for people like me out there to do my grassroots podcasts here, just like the YouTube's out there to have response videos for people wherever they are, then good on them. As long as there's space, the room to do that, then it's always going to be room for growth. And there's always going to be people that want to be involved in this. Just like social media, it's the same way. It's just some people look at it as another form of social media, another form of marketing. Absolutely. But for some other people, it's the public square. It's a chance to be a voice among the village so that you have your own points and you can make your own points. And it's pretty inexpensive to do when you think about it, regardless of what people say. The second effect has to do with the relationship with podcasting in Hollywood. That relationship has already been solidified well before this year, with talent agencies steadily increasing their involvement in over the space. Involvement plays on both directions. You have talent agencies greasing the pipelines for podcasters to jump into other media, and you have them greasing the pipelines for talents from other media to jump into podcasting. So yeah, we see celebrities getting themselves into podcasts and other people getting into podcasts, and, you know, it's a back and forth. And that's understood. Then there's Apple. Spotify has fundamentally redefined the story we've been telling all this time. That Apple's impartial stewardship is now distinctly a two-horse race. Apple's begun meeting with various podcast publishers to discuss exclusive content deals. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And this story talks about holding a position on what's going to happen to the full shape of whatever Apple Podcasts' official next move is supposed to be. If the Bloomberg report is right, what kind of publishers is Apple approaching? What is the driving strategy? And how will it differentiate Apple's new podcast order from the podcast world? Well, I don't give a shit about what everybody else does. These bigger name podcasts, I'm not worried about it. We're doing our own, where I'm working out of my full-time, and we're doing it all together with everything, which is fine. I'm good about all that. I'm not worried so much about it at all. So everybody can go on and talk about what they want to talk about. That's fine. But I am content with podcasting is right now. And that's what people are talking about. So people can talk about the Spotify versus Apple war because obviously they like conflict. Good for them. Doesn't matter to me. At the end of the story, they talk about the fact that NPR's podcast sponsorship revenue is predicted to beat broadcast sponsorship next year. So for anybody that thought that podcasting doesn't make money, you're wrong. NPR being able to support themselves with podcasting, good on them. Because they do a damn good job at it. That's why. And a lot of people follow the same kind of way of doing things. You know, I'm not the kind of person that wants to do NPR. Quick reminder that NPR's podcast sponsorship revenue is projected to beat broadcast sponsorship next year. But there's an opportunity for the public radio system as a whole to fashion itself as the home and advocate for independent and open podcasting. I couldn't even have the microphone set up the way that they do it for their shows. I couldn't even do anything like that, but I wouldn't want to try to. Not for me anyway. Now, moving along. Let's move along here to another story within the podcasting realm. Are podcasts threatening the growth of the music industry? And this is from Tim Ingham in Rolling Stone. He says that Rolling Stone first reported in October that streaming revenue growth is slowing down this year at the world's biggest music rights company. My God. Universal Music Group. Now, further number crunching on music business worldwide shows the same trend is true across all three major record companies. Well, if you keep putting out the same crap all the time and it all sounds the same, then there's a problem there, isn't there? So the major companies face a rampant threat from well-funded new school operators, many of whom have nine-figure funds from private equity and venture capital backers in their wallets. Companies include Mercuriadis, Hypnosis Songs Fund, and Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings, plus the likes of Primary Wave, Reservoir, and Round Hill, paying big money to acquire classic songs and recordings made famous by Taylor Swift, Elvis Presley, Whitney Houston, Ed Sheeran, and many more. And despite the forces in the major label world, the investment community at large remains steadfast in its positivity about music's future. Goldman Sachs, for one, says they think there will be more than 1 billion paying subscribers of streaming music by 2030. That's huge. So think about that. Now, we talked earlier about the Edison Research's serialized share of ear survey. More than 4,000 U.S. citizens over age 13 quizzed on the way they consume audio content today. In the stats, 2014, 80% of the U.S. population's listening hours were directed towards music. 20% dedicated to spoken word. 2019, the mainstream presence of podcasts erupting all around, stats have changed. Music share is down to 76%. Spoken word, 24%. 5% market share decreased for music from 2014 to 2019. 20% gain for spoken word. So people are much more worried about that because maybe the music's not doing that good right now. It's all digital. Not a lot of people using instruments. Rock music's not out there. The point I talked about with Lyra Salt a few weeks back on the podcast, talking about the music, how rock music, the anger, the rage, the rebelliousness of rock music not being there, and the kind of engagement of music. I mean, I listen to certain rap artists now, and artists come out with new records, brand new artists, and they come out with a second album or not, and they don't do as good. They're doing bad as a result. And that's not good for anybody, but that's actually what's definitely happening. Now, the IFPI, Global Trade Body for the Recorded Music Industry, they released their own report, Music Listening 2019. I think we talked about that. Based on a survey of 34,000 internet users worldwide. The average music fan now spends 18 hours a week listening to tunes. That's up from the previous year. So to close, everybody go ahead and calm down about podcasting and trying to say it's broke. TechCrunch needs to be ashamed of themselves for saying that the year podcasting broke. There's probably some kind of twist of story to it, but just to leave it as clickbait is pretty dishonest in my own opinion. I just want to say that. Now, speaking of dishonest people, the radio industry, let me go and close things out here on the Broadcasters Podcast and talk about it's the Tom Joyner Morning Show, right? The fly jock, Tom Joyner, who, you know, I mean, you can listen, you've probably heard him on the morning show, doing his show amongst most urban radio stations around the country. I forget how many hundreds he's been a part of, but we'll know that in the story I'll talk about in a second. But these are my own random thoughts here about Tom Joyner. The reason why Tom Joyner was called the fly jock is because he literally did work out of Dallas, Texas, and Chicago, Illinois. Because when he worked in Dallas, Texas, initially in his first station, the station he became best known for, he would also then go and fly across every day from doing, I believe, the morning show to do the afternoon drive show at WGCI. And that's what he used to do. And that he literally was getting on a plane every day to do both shows. And that's how the hardest working man in show business, or in radio, excuse me, it was the truth. Like, he wasn't bullshitting about that. He was the real deal. So let's talk about the real story of the Tom Joyner retirement. So, celebrating 25 years in entertainment, he will retire, and he's retired now. He revolutionized radio with his daily African-American targeted music show featuring news, interviews, live performances, and more. His brand extensions included annual events, engaging digital platforms, and a dedication to serving, empowering, and educating his local community and audience. He raised money for education for providing aids to those who need. Giving back to the community was always a priority. Relief funds that aided hurricane and tornado victims, supporting friends and families of taken survivors. He is leading the campaign to promote health and wellness in the African-American community. He has an annual wellness emphasis period, quote, take a loved one to the doctor season. Was expanding on weekly Get Well Wednesday feature segments on his broadcast show. He also has the Tom Joyner Foundation, which is striving, supporting students attending historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, with over $65 million raised to date. Each month, the Joyner recognizes the School of the Month and awards scholarships to deserving students looking to make a difference. He's been inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, received the National Associated Broadcasters Marconi Award. He has also been Billboard's Best Urban Contemporary Air Personality Award winner, and also won the NAACP Image Award, among many honorary doctorates. Tom Joyner is great. He is one of the best that comes down to radio. The guy was good, talented, had a good staff around him as well. Nothing bad to say about Tom Joyner. I enjoyed his work. I thought he was cool as shit. I thought some of his work, just listening to him, before he came on and became the morning show guy doing his own show, was amazing. Now, Joyner said in a statement, quote, 25 years ago, there was no template for a syndicated urban radio show, and we worked hard to prove that we could successfully produce and market a national platform that would entertain, inform, and empower African-American listeners. Now, he said in an interview with CBS News that Tom Joyner revealed it was continued cuts in his salary that led to his decision to retire. At one point in his career, he was making $14 million a year, and it was worth it. He said at each of his recent contract negotiations, his salary was cut in half. And he said, quote, because my salary was based on my results, and not only was I losing affiliates, but the radio industry as a whole was losing traction. And asked if he would have stayed on the air longer if it was offered more money to continue, he said, heck yeah. Shoot, my goal was to die on the radio, have my funeral on the radio. So, as I mentioned, before doing a syndicated morning show, being famously known as the Fly Jock, he used to commute between Dallas and Chicago, hosting mornings and afternoons respectively. And it's amazing to hear that story, to know that he's gone because of budget. How in the hell do you not pay this guy? And honestly, for Tom Joyner, why is this guy not being picked up by Sirius XM? Like, keep the show going, move it to Sirius. Or is it because the crowd might not be able to follow along? I don't know. But when you look at the word, and the one thing I guess you could say is, it's not a bad thing if he's going to retire now. He is 70 years old, so now he gets to go and really enjoy the fruits of his labor. He can continue to do his work. So I'm sure there's a bunch of that he can talk about. Now, going through his work in early life, okay, he was studied at Tuskegee Institute, graduated with a degree in sociology. And he worked in college radio, began his broadcasting career in Montgomery, Alabama, immediately upon graduation. And then he was a journeyman Worked in the South, the Midwest, worked in Memphis, St. Louis, worked in Chicago. Then in early 1978, worked at WVON doing the morning show. Left the station to move to another station, WBMX. And then in 1985 was when he really got his spark. Was offered 2 positions at the same time. One for a morning show at KKDA, K104 in Dallas. And in the afternoons, he worked at WGCI in Chicago. Instead of choosing between the two, he chose to take both jobs for 8 years. How about that? He commuted daily by plane between 2 cities, earning the nicknames the Flyjack and the hardest working man in radio. I should say that because that's the way he would say it. He also told Radio Inc. magazine he racked up 7 million frequent flyer miles over the course of his employment on both stations. A travel agent had found him a $30,000 fare that would guarantee him a round-trip seat for 5 years. And the funny part was that with both stations, he got to work with them simultaneously because neither of his 2 employment contracts had an exclusivity clause. Then he got signed by ABC Radio Networks to host his program, and he always featured a team of comedians and commentators reporting and discussing the latest news and sports of the day, playing popular R&B songs in the 70s or the 90s, as well as contemporary R&B hits. So he was always in the urban adult stations. That's really where he was best known for. Then he also did his own TV show for a while, and he also really did a hell of a job. And did a lot of work. Really important what he did. Also wrote a book in 2005. I'm just a DJ, but it makes sense to me. He also appeared with his father and grandfather in the documentary Rising from the Rails, the story of the Pullman Porter. And he's also done several cameo roles in several films. And he also hosted a show, the Ebony Jet Showcase. And he did quite a bit of work. Really amazing. And really good stuff. Why is it that radio is losing stars like this? And the problem is there is nobody out there ready to take his place. I mean, there isn't. Tom Joyner is as important as what Howard Stern was to radio as well. As important as Dan Ingram, as important as Gene Shepard, as important as name it. An institution in radio, one of the most important voices of radio. And now he could have kept going. He wanted to keep going. It's unfortunate. With all the money that guy was bringing in, radio didn't ever consider, whoever now runs this show, they never thought about the fact that, this guy is going to be able to continue to keep bringing in money because people kept listening to the show. Yeah, of course, there were some affiliates that would go away because stations would always change out. But for what it was worth, he did get to go on his own terms, which is cool. But, if he was still making money, let him retire when he wants to and just say, okay, I'm tired. I want to go ahead and step down. Even though he got to step down on his own terms, it should have never happened like this. Radio should have done better for him. But the good thing was Tom Joyner was smart enough to do a lot of different things. Very smart guy in his career. Look at what he did for his own career in the 80s into the 90s, up until he got this job. Very smart. Did a damn good job. So his voice will be missed on the airways, I'm sure. I'm curious as to who they're going to have that will come in and take the place. But it's too bad. Too bad to see that. So, Godspeed, best wishes to Tom Joyner and whatever he decides to do going forward. Obviously, he'll still be important out there. He'll still do things, and it'll be great. But for what it's worth, he delivered and did so much for radio, and I think he really made a big difference. And we don't have people like that anymore. Where are those voices that are supposed to take that spot? The future of radio? Well, there's not. And so what'll be funny to see is how they'll try to find somebody else to take over that syndicated morning show, be the scapegoat, only to have them fall out, and then it goes away. Remember not that long ago when Howard Stern left for Sirius, and I'll never forget when they decided to take half of the stations and put David Lee Roth on in certain markets and Adam Kroll in the other market. Well, Adam Kroll survived, but only really lasted in his own market in Los Angeles. Well, David Lee Roth, worked out in New York and only lasted a year. He just wasn't the right guy for it. And him by himself, without having the right people around him, wasn't going to work. So there you go. Anyway, we're going to leave that there. Time for me to go ahead and provide to all of you an amazing interview I had with broadcasting legend, sportscasting legend, Ann Liguori. We're going to talk about her work at WFAN AM and FM, being the first woman to be at the very first 24-hour sports talk station in the world. Her work in golf and tennis, her work in the Olympics, her work in charitable work. We're going to talk all about that. You're going to hear the first part of an hour-long interview. I got 30 minutes of the interview to play for you right now. My interview with Ann Liguori here on the Broadcasters Podcast. Enjoy. Now, I thought I was a workaholic, but then there's my next guest who is, shrouded. Just engulfed in so many great projects and has done so much work in a very illustrious career. She is one of the original show hosts of the world's first 24-hour per day sports talk radio station, WFAN AM and FM in New York City. She's also one of the original hosts of the Golf Channel. She's also the author of A Passion for Golf, Celebrity Musings About the Game. I'm here with radio and television golf commentating phenomenon, Ann Liguori. Ann, thanks for being with us here on the program.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I really do. Was really surprised to have you on because of all that you've done. Now, you also are president of your own company, Ann Liguori Productions. You are the owner of the Sports Innerview, INNER radio and cable series archives. And that features a collection of interviews that you have done, you continue to do with sports legends and entertainment stars. And let me talk about a little bit about that series and who you've talked to, because it's a who's who. It's Hall of Famers in their respects. Mickey Mantle, Ted Williams, Sam Snead, Hank Aaron, Julius Erving, Jim Brown, Gordie Howe, Billie Jean King, Wayne Gretzky, Charles Barkley, and Brett Favre. After the thousands of questions they might have been asked, Ann, this is my own question. Talk to me about your prep, and what do you hope to learn from each interview?
Well, gosh, that show, it started in 1989. My first guest was with the one and only Mickey Mantle, right at his restaurant, Mickey Mantle's restaurant on Central Park South. It's no longer there anymore, but that was a great first guest. And from there, the show aired every week for 17 years. And, I really pride myself on the fact that I was able to connect with so many legends in sports and entertainment, but, obviously focusing on sports legends. And, I just tried to, back then it was before the age of the internet, and, just being able to Google somebody's name and find out everything about that person that you could. Back then I used to, obviously get all the newspapers I could get my hands on, and I kept files of every personality in sports that I wanted to interview or that I knew I was going to interview. And I had file folders galore, and kept notes on everybody that I really wanted to talk to. And then, it was the old-fashioned way of doing research. Once I connected with a potential guest and booked the show and coordinated the show and all that, I just did as much homework as I could on that particular guest. But, it was pretty tedious back then just trying to do research on everybody, because we didn't have the computer system and the instantaneous information like we do today. So just looking back, it was quite the process. The support staff, did you have any particular resources in terms of if you had to reach to, say, biographers of these certain stars or, other, fellow athletes, or what was it you had to do, I guess? Were there any other kind of pre-interviews or other things that you did to try to grab some notes, to try to get something out of did they get more content out of the interview that was just said, aside from what the press gave you? Sure. I would read their biographies, autobiographies, any kind of, do a lot of work in the library, any kind of research the old-fashioned kind of research, really just going to and read books and things written about that person, as much as I could read about that person. So I would try to know more about that person than almost the person knew about himself, right? Before sitting down with him or her. So, it was a lot of work, but I think obviously the art of a excellent interview is doing your research and, then just asking great questions and then listening. I think listening is important. So, I would react to, what the person was saying, and then kind of take a break and a pause and let that person talk a little bit more. And that's when I really thought I would get, the best material, when my guest had a chance to kind of take a pause and maybe, decide what direction they wanted the conversation to go.
Now, besides probably having to have a good, strong comfort level, not to feel starstruck with some of these stars, that for some people, they will be, just fandom would just overcome them if they got to meet somebody in person or get their autograph, God forbid. But now, are you ever thinking in the back of your mind what the fans of these stars, obviously, like you say, I'm Mickey Mantle, and you have all these Yankees fans for years and years on, generations of fans, they're watching this show, and these fans are expecting you to ask certain questions to their sports idols, the kinds of takeaways they expect from a feature interview that you would conduct. I mean, did you ever try to think about, okay, the fans, you want to learn about this and they want to learn about that, and they don't want to just hear just some run-of-the-mill interview. I have to come with something more. Take me through what you would normally have to think about. That would have to be that one question that okay, I got him to say this.
Well, yeah, I mean, every personality is different. And, once I basically did thorough research on each guest, I then, kind of took a step back and thought, what do I really want to know about this person? And what do my viewers and listeners really want to know about this person? And what has never been revealed? I mean, what kind of conversations, can I get into that, obviously respecting each athlete, each personality, but, how can I get that person to share parts of themselves that perhaps they haven't said on another show? And that's basically the approach I took. I wanted every interview to be unique, and I wanted, the person to feel comfortable talking to me. I wasn't there to, exploit the person or embarrass the person. Basically the show's about their success stories, and each personality that I try to connect with is very inspirational. So, I wanted the takeaway to be both revealing and inspirational at the same time.
Now, one thing that's really fascinating about your career is the kind of autonomy that you've had, basically to steer your career where you wanted it to go, it feels like, from what I've read. Now, you're currently the golf and tennis correspondent for WFAN Radio, CBS Sports Radio. You broadcast from the Masters. You've been doing it over 20 years, I believe. You've done the PGA Championships, the U.S. Open Golf, U.S. Open Tennis Championships, the Open Championship, PGA Tour, LPGA, and the Ryder Cup. You've covered 6 Olympic Games. When you were asked about what do you enjoy most about your work, you said this, quote, covering a variety of sports, interviewing fascinating people, and I love to travel. I love the flexibility of being my own boss. I want to, end quote, I want to ask about having that full control of what you work on, which I think everybody ultimately would love to have when you have a career like what you're doing. How does it keep you motivated to keep such a busy schedule at this point in your career after all that you've done?
I just love being my own boss and making my own travel decisions, making my own choices of what I cover and who I interview. Nobody really tells me, what to do, which is, I guess I'm so used to being my own boss. I don't ever want to take that for granted, but I guess I'm just not a corporate kind of gal.
I mean, either. I've been there.
Where I'd want to be sitting in an office from 9 to 5 somewhere, I mean, I'm working round the clock doing what I love. And I just think that's the most important thing for people listening. Just pursue something that you're very passionate about. And whether you're independent and your own boss, or whether you're working, for somebody else or collaborating with somebody else, which I do on a number of projects, you just have to have a passion for what you do and pursue it. And a lot of times you don't pursue it, obviously, because there's a lot of money involved. You pursue the project or your career because you love what you do. And that's basically what I've done. I mean, when I was just starting out in the 80s, women weren't given a lot of opportunities, in sports broadcasting.
Right.
And so I started producing shows and putting radio and TV shows together. But in order to afford to be able to be in the business, I had to bring in my own sponsors. And I basically taught myself how to do that. It's not easy. And a lot of people, don't do it and would not think about doing it. But that's basically how I started because I had to.
But that's
years ago, MSG
is the fact that that is one thing very important. Is what you just said is that you had to had to go look for sponsors. You had to do your own advertising and marketing of your own brand. The idea is
everything,
right?
Everything A to Z.
You have to be, and I call it a Swiss Army knife when it comes to media now. You just can't be one thing that you do. There has to be multiple skill sets to whatever you're doing right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if you've done work behind the camera to get, setting or lighting, getting, whatever you're producing done just right, or having to go and work and, again, trying to go and filter out the guests you want to bring on, the research you have to bring on. So much is there. You're not just sitting there behind the camera. You have so much going on behind the scenes. You've learned that early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times now in the business, you have to know, in front of the camera, behind the camera, you have to do a lot of different things. But, back then I took it a step further because I had to, get the show paid for. So I went out and sold the show I went out and acquired sponsors. I went on knocking down doors on Madison Avenue at a time, when the TV show started in 1989, when, advertising executives were not used to women hosting sports shows. And they certainly were not used to women, who were hosting shows to go out and bring in the sponsorship dollars for their shows. So, was I a trailblazer? Yes. I was just doing things that weren't really being done, but it was the only way I could come up with the finances to pay for the show and the production staff and these TV shows that were on for so many years. So, it was interesting, new ground and great opportunity. And I kind of taught myself how to do it, and I'm still doing it. Once
right.
You become independent and are used to kind of running that whole show from A to Z, I think, I enjoy that. And so, I continue to go out and bring in sponsors for my radio work and for my TV projects.
And when I think about it, it's been more than 40 years that we've seen the era, the advent of this female sportscaster, and to see the growth and the evolution of the opportunities been allowed to women in sports on television and radio. So you come along the lines, and I would put you in the same era as the first generation of female sportscasters. I think of Phyllis George, Jane Kennedy, Leslie Visser, Gail Gardner, Mary Carrillo. That's just a handful of names when I come right off the mind. Now the landscape has changed. And I'll look at some of the accomplishments. And honestly, when I look at the names I have here, they're great sportscasters. Fantastic. Doris Burke, Pam Ward, Andrea Kramer, Hannah Storm, Beth Bones. They've all had the opportunity to do play-by-play for the NFL, NBA, and Division I NCAA, and have done exceptionally well, in my opinion. Talk to me about how you feel, your feelings about the opportunities, and how they have gradually increased, and how you see other women as like yourself getting those opportunities first and foremost, more opportunities than before.
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, the landscape has changed. There's more opportunity out there. There's more channels. There's the internet. There's all kinds of platforms, radio stations, networks. I mean, there's a lot more out there, right, than there was when I first started. And it wasn't that long ago, but ESPN was in its infancy, and these regional sports cable networks were just kind of looking for programming, and there weren't a lot of niche channels. The Golf Channel started in the 90s, and the Tennis Channel. So all these niche channels, kind of came into being as well, which opened up the door for to hire more people. So, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these networks obviously are giving more and more women the opportunity. I like seeing, the women who go in there and can host their own shows. and do play-by-play and really do significant work in sports broadcasting. But I also think owning your own programming is very important, and being in a position to hire. And I think it'd be great to see more women in sports broadcasting who are in those positions to hire. And, the fact that, I've always owned my own programming. The Sports Innerview show is something that, when I first started, I maintained the rights to every show that I've ever done. And, that's an important concept as well. So I think, we still have room to improve as women in sports broadcasting. And, but I certainly have seen, improvements since I started. I mean, in 1989, MSG Network told me they loved my work. They could come up with a time slot for my show every week, but they couldn't pay me. So, I mean, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, if you have a dream like I did, and you wanted to host a show and interview sports legends, then I went out and started bringing in my own sponsors. And it kind of forced me to do that because that was the only way I was going to be able to pay for the series. So, everybody has to start somewhere, right? Everybody has their own situation and their own challenges to overcome. And, I still think women have a long way to go, not only in our business, but in other businesses. But we certainly have made some progress, which is a good thing.
And a couple things to unpack from that. Diversity, inclusivity are very common right now with the culture of way people are watching their media and consuming anything, which that is understood, but it still comes down to the caveat for me that the people that should be in front of a camera and should be on, hosting programming or calling games is based on performance. And that's what I think is always rising to the cream of the crop is those that are performing well, that are good at their job. And that's what's most important is that it doesn't matter to me who's calling the game for me, as long as that person knows what they're doing, they're well aware of what their situation is, and they help make the experience of watching sports on television a better experience for round. The other thing I got to mention is I can only imagine the importance of when you're able to go and control your own programming and own your own programming because of all the legends you talk to. I can imagine the Hall of Fames for the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball. They probably, on a regular basis, if they need biographical content, they must come to you because you have interviews, you have pictures, descriptions that they can use. So obviously, that there's multiple ways, pipelines of monetizing that show. Just as a financial aspect, that must be great for what you're able to do. Having all that archive content, it's always going to have value over and over.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the main thoughts when I poured all my own money into producing the show and paying the production staff, obviously getting sponsors to come in. But I just thought, I should maintain the rights to these shows and, be able to license them forever. Yeah. They're so educational. I mean, how many people have over 500 half-hour one-on-one interviews with these legends? Many of these sports legends not around anymore. They're very educational. It's great educational programming. So there are ways to monetize it. I probably could do better in that department, but, because I'm so busy doing all my day-to-day work. But I am sitting on a treasure chest of archives, and, it's just incredible when I go back and listen to the interviews and watch the interviews. Yeah, I'm very impressed. I'm like, wow, those are really good. So, I'm proud of what I've been able to put together.
I would be. For who you talked to, it's legendary. I want to move on to another subject now. NBCSports.com recently wrote, quote, "The fallacy of sports and politics sleeping in different beds. They've always been linked, always will be locked in an embrace of varying comfort levels. Pretending otherwise is breeding ignorance of facts that pass before our eyes every day," quote unquote. So I'm talking about the stories like you see from Colin Kaepernick to Jamel Hill to the NBA China discussion. What do you think about the injection of politics into our sports and political correctness being brought to the forefront instead of just playing the game?
I'm against it. I really am. I don't think, athletes or entertainers should talk about politics. Right. I really don't. I don't think, I don't really care what their opinions are on politics. If it's a broadcaster, a sports broadcaster, stick to sports.
Yeah.
Stick to your opinion on a sports issue or a sports personality or, what's happening with that sports personality. But I'm really not interested in a sports broadcaster's or an athlete's opinion on politics or, something beyond their, the sports world. So I'm against that kind of thing. I don't care what they have to say about it.
No. And I was surprised at certain outlets because they think there was a way to monetize from it, I guess. And I think ESPN was the biggest culprit of it. They thought they could go that route. And I know that, I believe it was John Skipper that came back to run programming, and he took that out. He's like, no, let's stick to sports. There's enough politics out there for everyone else to watch or look at on social media anyway. I mean, when I look at most recently the Deadspin.com website, that they fired their staff because they decided not to write about sports. And not originally, that site was made to write about sports. They decided to inject politics. And I'm like, no. I mean, there's places to go for that. There are places to go ahead and consume that kind of content. If you want that, then it's always available somewhere else. That's the spectrum of programming we have. But to continue to infiltrate it and every different thing that we have is just not productive. I agree with you.
Not productive.
Yeah.
And who cares? I mean, there's so many talking heads out there. It's just over the top, I think, even in politics. I mean, especially in politics, right? Each side just so fanatical. And it just seems like there's no reason anymore, right? On either side, it's so extreme. Certainly there's enough talking heads, on TV, in the political world. We certainly don't need our athletes and our sports personalities, be it athletes or broadcasters, to delve into that world. It's just, it's just something, there's a few people out there whose opinions I really respect.
Yeah.
And, just those people should really focus and stay focused on their areas of expertise. That's how I feel about it.
I mean, because sports, the athletes are entertainers. Plus, if you're going to be having causes, you want to have things you want to support, I'll appreciate those that are actually activists, that are actually putting something, injecting what they're trying to do. That would give me a little more credence to hearing you. Maybe hear you if you have a point to say, but not the whole subject of the matter. And that's where I come from with that. Now,
I mean, I just recently watched my interview with Jim Brown, which was done in the 90s. And Jim and I have become friends. And he's been on my radio show and my TV shows many times through the years. And, Jim Brown is very opinionated and quite controversial. But, his whole movement his whole focus, at least in the 90s, was his American program and helping gang leaders learn life management skills. And certainly that had nothing to do with sports, but I respect that in an athlete. If they're in a position where they can influence other people in a positive way, that is something that I enjoy talking to personalities about, And so a lot of these personalities, yes, they do a lot of other things to try to inspire and try to support and help, the good of society and mankind. So that I'm very in favor of. So I'd love talking to athletes about the work they're doing to help people. But when it gets political and if it gets critical and if it gets, fanatical, then, I don't want to hear it.
Exactly. Let's talk about your work in radio. So you were the first woman to host a call-in sports show on what is ultimately the first 24-hour-a-day sports radio station in the world in New York City, WFAN. You hosted a five-hour weekly call-in sports show for it's 20 years. That's a 5-hour shift. That's a long time. You were in the same building. Oh, my God, this was the most fun. You were there with Mike and the Mad Dog, Mike Francesca, and you were John Sterling. Susan Waldman was in the same building, Michael Kay, and others. Now you're hosting a weekend golf show on WFAN. So you've been there over 25. Well, it's been 30 years the station's been on. Over 30 years, if I'm correct.
Right. The station, WFAN, started in 1989.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 1987. Gosh, my Sports Innerview show, my TV show started in 1989. Now, WFAN started in 1987, and I was the first woman to host a sports call-in show. I'll never forget it. It was July 4th, actually.
Wow.
And, my first interview was with Doc Gooden. He had just come out of Smithers rehab, of all things, and I knew because being a woman, I had to come up with just a very controversial, or not controversial, but, just a very huge guest for my first show. And so I was able to get an exclusive interview with Doc Gooden, and I was the first one to get him when he came out of rehab. Everybody wanted to talk to him, and the Mets had just won the World Series in '86, the fall of '86. So, and the station started in July of '87. So I was able to do it. I kind of bypassed the PR director, and then once I got to Doc Gooden, there were all kinds of beat writers. We were at Shea Stadium. There were all kinds of Mets beat writers there who wanted to, stick their microphone in my interview. And so I had to basically politely ask Doc if he would go in a different room so I could do the interview without everybody else sticking their microphones, under his mouth. And so he followed me to, at the time, it was the Jets locker room at Shea Stadium. Now, of course, it's Citi Field, and only the Mets play there. But and he followed me in there, and we did. I had to basically tell him it was a taped interview. This was the week before the station started, so I had to basically tell him what FAN was going to be.
Oh my God!
And he didn't even know about it, and so I taped the interview, and it was July 4th, and yes, the Hey Ligouri, What's the Story show started off with a bang on July 4th, and kept airing for 26 straight years every week. So it was it started being Saturday mornings, then I went to 5-6 hours on the overnights and the weekends, and then the last couple of years I did the show, it was Sunday nights from 10 to 1. So it was once a week, and just really great. I liked talking about issues in sports more than anything, and taking phone calls. And really had a lot of fun all those years doing that show.
Totally. So Dwight Gooden actually knew about the WFAN first came on. And honestly, I was a Braves fan in the late 80s. And I'll tell you, I was always very jealous of the Mets, and Darryl Strawberry, and just and win the World Series. And come on, there was just a lot of fun there. And it was
a great team. I mean, Gary Carter, Howard Johnson, Davey Johnson, the manager, Doc, Dwight. It was it was just a lot of fun. Those guys, Gary Carter, they were really hardworking guys, blood and guts, and they managed to win that World Series in '86, which was wonderful. So, the station started right after that. So there was a lot of attention.
Right, and the best part was all the sports teams were really good at the time. Knicks were going hot. The Rangers were real well. You had a lot of good sports to talk about, so people were really excited.
People were very excited, and of course, New York. There's always, Yankees, Mets, Jets, Giants, Rangers, Islanders, Devils. There's so many pro sports to talk about. So there, we all. And then I throw in golf and tennis. Cover the U.S. Open tennis all these years, every year.
Yeah.
And there's always stuff to talk about. I always like getting into sports issues too. I mean, talking about trading guys and who's pitching tonight, and those topics kind of were okay, but you don't want to keep talking over and over about those topics. But sports issues were great. I would get experts on to talk about head injuries in sports, or, the drug issue in sports, or, every week we'd come up with different topics that were, hopefully it was intelligent programming. And I'd get experts to come on, and then we'd take calls, and I'd have everybody on from Jim Brown to Kevin Rooney when Mike Tyson got knocked out by Buster Douglas in Tokyo. I had Kevin Rooney on as my guest. And he was watching. He had just been fired by Tyson.
Right.
And he was livid that, he had been fired, that he wasn't in Tokyo in the corner to help to help Mike Tyson, who had been with for so many years. And watching on the TV, Mike Tyson getting knocked out for the first time in his career. He was on my show just going crazy when he was watching that. So, through the years, I'd had incredible guests. Gene Shepard, from the Christmas Story fame, narrator and writer. He was a recluse, and I got him on the show. He came on my show, and everybody was just so delighted to hear the great Gene Shepard talk a little baseball. He's a huge baseball fan. So, we had a lot of fun guests during that run.
I remember Gene Shepard was a fellow radio host. He worked overnights, and you knew that you were listening to his show because he made sure everybody at their front doorstep put their light on. Is that right?
WOR, remember those days? It was before my time, I have to say, because I grew up in Ohio.
I read the story about it. I was like, that's so cool. That's radio back in those days. And
that's right.
because I want to talk about the celebrities you've talked to, the other ones you've talked to besides Gene Schefter. I want to ask about, because now sports radio has gotten, because 66 and, the WFAN has gone through a lot of different changes of the ownership. Now you have ESPN Radio being involved, and you have all these other sports radio outlets that are over the place. And most markets, they probably have 3 or 4 sports radio stations in it. Do you think it's a little bit bloated at this point? Do you think there's too much? And do you feel like it still has a good, it's obviously the popular format for radio to go to these days, but do you feel like there's a little too much? It's a little bit overkill these days.
I think there's oversaturation in everything, whether it's sports radio or whether it's, political shows on TV. Every cable channel has all these, as I say, talking heads talking politics. Mm-hmm. I love the days when there were actually fewer channels and you could go to, an ESPN, or you could go, to the network and catch all your sports. I just think that, it's totally changed the media, all this consolidation. There's newspapers, journalists are losing, their clout and their jobs. There's so much out there now that people are making less money. They're, they don't want to pay. They want to hire young people and not pay veterans and experienced journalists and personalities. So the business has totally changed in that way. So yeah, I just think it just became, there's too many niche channels and it's become devalued, unfortunately.
Next week, I'll have more of my interview with Ann Liguori here on the Broadcasters Podcast. I want to see what else I'm going to be doing when it comes to how I'll be closing out the last 2 weeks of the program. Well, actually, I'll have one more show for the end of the year, and then I'll start looking for some more interviews to start getting ready to go, and hopefully get started talking more about the trade unions and all the disputes going on with that. If any of you are people within the industry, trade union insiders, those that understand all the disputes here and the lawsuits and the like, and understands what's going on here, I'd love to get some experts on here to talk about it and get some more perspective as we look at what 2020 will be. It will be the year of the trade unions in Hollywood, and to see if we're going to get a walkout, a strike, and how streaming media is the reason why everybody wants to go and change the dynamic of how Hollywood is run, because it is changing right now, right in front of our eyes. And I've talked about it for the last year, and it's only going to increase next year as we continue more of the Broadcasters Podcast. Remember, till next week, I'll have part 2 with Ann Liguori, and I leave you with my normal phrase, content is king, and remember the control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast, presented by BroadcastersPodcast.com and KingOfPodcasts.com. The Broadcasters Podcast is brought to you by KingOfPodcasts.com/Amazon. If Amazon is good enough for the King of Podcasts, it most certainly is good for you. KingOfPodcasts.com/Amazon. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program. The Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at KingOfPodcasts.com.